Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peter Giannetti, Editor-in-Chief of Homeworld Business, and welcome to the fifth installment of the six-part webinar series presenting the first ever International Housewares Association Market Watch Report. Once again, I'm pleased to have a panel of collaborators in the creation of this inaugural report who will offer a revealing look into a key consumer lifestyle trend identified by the report and how that trend intersects with the home and housewares business. Our panelists today will also highlight how the trend and corresponding consumer attitudes and behaviors have been shaped by the COVID pandemic, and they'll outline implications for suppliers and retailers. Let's begin with an introduction of the Market Watch authors and the webinar series panelists. We have Leana Salamah, Vice President of Marketing for IHA, Joe Derochowski, Vice President and Home Industry Advisor for the NPD Group, and Tom Mirabile, Principal and Founder of Springboard Futures. Welcome, everyone. A reminder before we get started today that we will leave time for audience questions before the conclusion of today's session. And our audience may post questions using the Q&A function along the bottom of the Zoom window. And recordings of each session will be available soon after their conclusion at the Inspired Home Show website, theinspiredhomeshow.com. The first four Market Watch sessions covered time, space, experience, and wellness. Today, we'll be looking at the concept of responsibility. It's a highly personal and uniquely sensitive issue that certainly has presented more urgency in recent months, and it's one that all businesses have to confront. From environmental issues to social issues, consumers are demanding responsible actions from major stakeholders. Younger generations are leading the charge and they're paying close attention. Simply put, companies must offer more than a good product at a good price. The value equation is shifting and responsibility is a major component. Let's get started. Many of the statistics in the Market Watch report point to an increasing consumer awareness of the need for responsible behavior by brands and retailers. Let's start with Tom. Tom, give us a sense of kind of how this is playing out. What constitutes responsibility in your view, and maybe some examples if there are some brands and retailers or businesses kind of reflecting that. And we'll go through everyone on this question. Tom?
Well, it's a great question because responsibility, it's one of those things, if you ask 10 people, you get 10 different answers, right? So, but I think the way, when we looked at responsibility for this report in particular, we look at responsibility as covering environmental protection, social equity, economic health, and even cultural vitality. You know, I mean, so it's a broad, it's a broad topic, and there are a lot of different ways to approach it, so but I think that's the best way to frame it.
Yeah. Joe, your thoughts on what's responsibility and how's that manifested kind of at the retail level and with the products in the business?
Well, I'll talk more about like the spirit of it. If you think about it, the millennial generation originally not only thought you had to be healthy and eat healthy, but they would say you have to eat organic fruits and vegetables. They got into how a product was manufactured, how it played out. And then over time, this definition has just gained more and more throughout every aspect of it, whether social responsibility, whether how sustainable a product is, that whole definition. And as we were preparing for it, I thought it was kind of funny. I saw this little note that I had for my daughter, and she wrote this in school, and she's 9. It says, if every household in the U.S. reused a paper bag for one shopping trip, about 60,000 trees would be shaved. And she has little pictures and stuff like that. She's 9. She's 9, and this is part of the exercises in school. So it's one of the things where it's becoming such a component that schools are teaching it. They're teaching it to the next generation of shoppers that we're getting. This is just very, very important on how a company and how a product is manufactured and how a company, what they stand for. All of that is being very, very much more important today.
Leanna, is there any question that consumers are rewarding brands and companies, retailers for this type of marketing where they bring the responsibility, whether it's social, environmental, whatever it is, to the kind of foreground of the marketing strategy?
Yeah, I mean, at least leading into the COVID crisis, we're going to talk a little bit about how the COVID crisis in the last few months, and not just that, but even also some of the other things going on in society right now have impacted and maybe shifted some of what was really true when this report was created back in the beginning of the year. But no question at the time, there's a number of stats related to how people spend their money and how they want to align themselves with these values. For example, 63% of millennials at the time we put this report out were spending more on brands that align with their social values. So whatever that may be, it may not be that they are spending more on a given product because it comes from a company that aligns with their social values, but if they perceive a company or a brand as aligning with them, they are more apt to buy more from that brand. There's also another fact that stated that, again, millennials, when asked about what they would be willing to spend for products created under healthy conditions. And what does that mean? It probably means a number of things, as Tom mentioned, but they are willing to pay up to 17.5% more on a $100 product if they perceive that product as having been developed under favorable, responsible conditions.
Even when we look at environmental responsibility, environmental responsibility alone, statistically, from boomers are, when asked what each generation does the environmental responsibility of the product that you're buying and the way it was manufactured affect your purchase decision. 55% of boomers did, and up to 68% in Gen Z. So, and that's just going to keep, it's going to keep going, but it means that we have to, to a point Joe made.
Well, I think it's important that you mentioned that this is, while there's so much discussion about millennials and younger generations driving this trend in particular, it is not limited or exclusive to them. And it's really trickling up the generational ladder to really much of the buying power in this marketplace right now. When you look at the measurement that you call it trend viability mapping, it helps identify some of the key attributes. And Leana talked about changes kind of before and during and after COVID. Tom, start with you. What are some of the key areas that you kind of see that you can kind of measure with regard to the issue of responsibility right now?
Well, I think when we talked about responsibility, one of the things that we looked at was, for example, category breadth. There is not a single category of housewares product that cannot participate in this in some way. I want to give an example. When you look at the flatware business, okay, flatware is it's $1 billion business, and it's a notoriously dirty business. Okay, you have to use a lot of polishing compounds, and you have to manufacture the steel. A lot of energy is used. That doesn't mean that you can't participate in this trend. There's carbon credits, there's recycling programs, there's a lot of different things. It's going to take some thought, it's going to take some commitment, but in terms of category breadth, this is a trend that everybody can and should be taking advantage of. So, we rated it high on viability. That doesn't mean that's what's happening now, that's how viable it is. Right. Longevity, it's not going away. Responsibility, it's a trend that is here for us. Longevity is 3 to 5 years. It's going to go beyond 5 years. This is something we're all living with every day.
Right.
So, an aspirational value, it started off high, because consumers want it. Consumers aspire to a better environment, aspire to helping the planet, aspire to better working conditions. This is something that is now in the public consciousness.
Why don't we lay over some of how the map has changed a little bit during the pandemic. Leana, address how this is one of those maps that I think saw the most change of all the trends that we're dealing with right now, and kind of take us through that if you could.
Sure. Specifically, I want to talk a little bit about, Tom mentioned the aspirational value, which of course was already very high, but the increase in kind of the rational need. And when we talk about rational need, it's really about how urgent is this need? Is it a need to have, or it is a want to have? And on the rational side, I think that and we're going to talk about this a little bit, but that when we put this report together originally, we were very, very focused on the environmental sustainability side of responsibility, and the social aspects of responsibility were important, but maybe weren't as prominent. That has changed significantly in the last 3 months with, with everything that's going on out in the country right now. So as a rational need, when you're starting to think about responsibility, less in terms of what's the environment going to look like for my children and my children's children, right? That feels more aspirational. I really want to leave something better. Right now, responsibility is about, is about safety and security for myself and for my fellow man, right? There are people out there who are being actively harmed either through irresponsible practices related to COVID-19 or irresponsible practices related to how we treat one another out in society.
Right. Joe, any thoughts on this? This is where it gets a little interesting, how we have to toggle back and forth between these different types of responsibility. Ultimately, they all kind of meld together. I think you have the industry has a responsibility to take all of it into account as they're looking at product development, marketing, and merchandising. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was kind of funny when we were preparing for this, we were talking about in the changes that we saw. And I remember at one time, it was like, really a little part of this was part of health and wellness, because in the sense that by you're doing good or doing good for the environment or doing good for something externally, it helps you feel better. But what we've seen now over since the pandemic is just how broad and important that this is. And another layer to this is not just what you do in the product or for the consumers, but it's also how you handle your employees, your organization. And the second you start doing that with all the changes that are happening that Leana was talking about, it really does make it much more actionable as well. There's a lot of ways that we can help this, not only with the consumer, but also with the way we operate our own organizations.
Tom, do you think that the companies have to toggle back and forth? Can they kind of encompass this whole idea, or do they have to maybe zero in on one area of it where they might have the greatest advantage or might be able to make the strongest statement?
I think right now that there's some disparity between where the consumer's focus is and where the industry's focus is. And it's very, the industry's focus still is largely environmental, to be honest with you,
right.
Because it's so strongly related to health and wellness. It's in our blood. It's things that we can change, and they're very long term. And we're a little bit slower to react to social issues so much, especially since technology really solves a lot of the problems that environmentally. Right. That said, we have to focus on both. You have to be aware of both. Whether that's the people that you hire in the industry, the people you've got doing every single job in the building, whether it's that.
Go ahead, Leana.
I was going to say, I think we need to think a little bit about, certainly companies can do both, but what Tom is saying is so critical about making sure you're meeting the consumer where they're at. Because while I don't think the value of environmental stewardship has by any means decreased, it's complicated right now by some of what's going on with COVID and everything else. So, having things that are non-disposable, I can't bring my reusable bags to the grocery store right now. I'm not allowed to. I have to use disposable. So a lot of the progress that we've made as an industry against the environmental side of things is fighting an uphill battle right now, because people's mentality have shifted to this, maybe disposable is okay for at least the time being. So meeting the consumer where they're at is really, I think, important as folks consider what products to develop and how to change whatever business practices they may need to change.
It's hard to generalize what can be very personal motivations with regard to responsibility, whether it's social, environmental. But the one thing it seems clear to me, and it is that the consumer, if 9-year-olds are starting to pay attention and write notes about this thing, the consumer is really vetting their stakeholders. We talked about that earlier. This is not one area where if you make a promise and that is a promise unfulfilled, it could have very serious long-lasting consequences from a standpoint of brand loyalty or patronage. Unlike if you say something is going to be blended in 30 seconds and it takes 35 seconds, it's not really measured the same. This is highly personal. It's individualized, but it's also catalytic. It's got everyone kind of going at the same time. So before we move on to some of the product implications, and maybe it's embedded in the product implications, how does a company prove that they are able and capable of fulfilling whatever promise they make with regard, or whatever proposition they make with regard to being responsible? I'll go through the panel. Joe, I'll start with you on that.
Well, I think one, when any company sets their mission and their vision and their strategy, you know, those sessions are very, very important because it really helps you identify who you are. Now, if you can do that in conjunction with a deep, deep understanding of your core consumer, of who you're going after, that kind of helps. But that then sets up the approach that you have to things, the way things are rewarded, the way things are operated. All of these issues, as Leana said, is very, very complicated. It's not a thing that you can just say, okay, well, I did it for 1-2 days and we're done. This is something that is an everyday across all the spectrums. It is an everyday challenge, is an everyday task and responsibility that you have to get done. And with that, it just kind of has to be built into the fiber of your organization and the fiber and how you execute. And it has to constantly be being updated every day.
It's fluid. It's changing and evolving kind of day by day. Tom, your thoughts on this need to make sure you can kind of vet your own claim before you make that claim to the consumer?
Well, I think, you know, I think that sometimes people, to Joe's point, it has to start not looking at the consumers, but looking at yourself. You know, it has to start with a mission inside your organization, whether you're a brand or a trade show or whoever you are, that you're going to do everything possible and to sit down and identify what that is. I think that, you know, consumers are they're very intelligent. They will find you out if you're greenwashing or doing anything like that, or whether you're, you know, social washing or black washing, as they're calling it now too, you know. But I think that an important thing, I'm so struck by what Joe said about his 9-year-old, and it brought a statistic to mind that Nielsen released last fall. 93% of parents with Gen Z kids say that their kids affect the products, the decisions that they make about buying, and the products that they buy. So when you've got a generation that is so tied to justice, responsibility is a form of justice, right? That goes into your decision making, because even if they're not with you when you're purchasing, when you get it home, they're going to grill you on it. I've been there. You know, it's like, you know, they ask you, what is this? And, you know, so it's like, and there's so much of it already going on in our industry. Look at all the people using bamboo and, you know, FSC, you know, and getting qualifications and getting, you know, there are plenty of organizations that will help you vet, you know, where your money goes or where your contributions go. So,
Leana, consumers are researching this more than they ever have. They're not just looking at what the product does for them and how it works and what it costs. They are actually starting to look deep into these brands to see if their values kind of line up with them. As we move into some of these product and implications for suppliers, and we've talked a little bit about, and Thomas started the conversation about demonstrating sort of corporate values and understanding what your mission is. What do consumers expect? What are they looking for? What will make them believe that, hey, this is a company that I feel good supporting?
So I'm actually going to take a slightly cynical point of view about this. I think you're right. I think that there are a lot of folks out there who are researching and really looking at the whole supply chain, and who are going to make decisions and decide what they do and don't feel good about based on everything related to what a brand or company does, not just what they produce, but how they produce it. But I don't think we can deny that it is still actually possible to successfully launch a product that solves some kind of, you know, that replaces disposable products, or that, you know, doesn't have these other things. And that you can see success with that without having it track back through your entire organization. There are some people who just aren't that, you know, they're not looking at your company values as much as they're looking at the product that you put out makes them feel better about not throwing out a straw.
Yeah, I think my point means you should be prepared for people to do that kind of research.
Well, and you should know.
That's where they might find out it's not as sincere as they thought it was.
Yes, they absolutely should be prepared. And if that is what you're going to put out, if what you want to put out as a company and organization is that that's a core value of yours, that had better be authentic, and it had better be transparent. You better be able to live up to that. So, you know, I think there's, you know, I'm a little cynical about, you know, that everyone has to do it. It's all or nothing. But if that's part of who you want to be, and that's the consumer you're after, that's your target customer, then 100%, you have to go the full 9 yards on it.
Oh, I agree 100% with what you're saying. I don't think it's all or nothing. I really don't. I just mean you have to look at, of course, we have to look at what the consumer wants, but I think that we have to at least look at ourselves and say, are we doing what we can? You know, because the consumers are really forgiving. If you can't fix everything, they will, you know, they'll say at least they're doing what they can. And by the way, I do agree with you. It's almost a separate channel things that demonstrating corporate responsibility and solving the consumer problem of, I don't want to throw out one more thing, you know.
And I think with regard to corporate values is, you know, just don't do anything. Some of us don't do anything stupid, right? Because some people will be inclined to buy from a specific company or brand because of the things that they're doing right, but other people will shun a brand for things that they're doing wrong. And those aren't mutually exclusive by any means. But some of it is, you know, let's not use child labor, right? Because if somebody finds out you're doing that, people are going
that's that if you're going to make a claim, you better be prepared to stand up to it. I was speaking to a friend of mine who saw that one of the major retailers in our market, and it doesn't matter who, but put prominently on the website, put a link to their points of view on diversity and inclusion and things like that. And the first thing this person said to me, to your point on cynicism, Leana, is, you know what? I don't believe it. I just know that they're put there because they feel they have to. That is the challenge between what is real and what is perceived. That gap has to be bridged. Before we get into some specific products, Joe, any additional thoughts on this kind of demonstrating corporate values, living up to those values, and understanding how it all fits into the consumer equation?
Yeah, I think if you think about it, right now is probably one of the greatest brand building times that we are in. And what that is, a brand is an emotion. And a lot of times people will build it. They'll try to apply a rational need. They'll try to apply emotional need or some sort of balance with it. But if you're going to do that, that means you have to have a deep understanding of all the consumers and inside what they're thinking and what they're feeling, and try to be figuring out how I can connect to that. It's not like the 80s where the brands were be like Mike and we tried to be like him. It is a time where we're now trying to understand how those consumers are representing themselves to the world and how we can be part of that. And to do that, though, because all these things are so complicated, it's just the little bits that are authentic. You know, what Leana said is absolutely right. Because it's your brand, because it is an image, because it is an emotion, you've got to be able to understand that you are authentically in it. And to the degree of that is going to vary. It could be just how the energy that your plants are using. There's so many facets that could be done that just a little bit of movement gets there. Now, how much that plays in your communication to the consumer, how much that plays into your marketing, that's a different choice. But the key is making sure that it is authentic. And to start there, you got to understand the consumer and figure out what you're really trying to be about and how you want to manage it.
It's interesting you talk about this being a great brand building period. It's one of those times where the little guy or the newcomer actually has a chance to jump in through various platforms that are available now to establish a unique and compelling brand identity that, compared to an established brand that may have to reset that brand or nurture that brand. So it's an interesting time where the little guys can scream a little louder right now, and the big guys have to be aware that while they control a lot of the market share, it can be more vulnerable if you're not aware of what's happening. Any thoughts on that? I'm just bringing that into the mix, but this is a time for brands to reset themselves, to build themselves, and to introduce themselves.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. The companies that are able to be nimble and to pivot from one practice to another, or even come from nothing and actually build from the ground up in a responsible manner, have a lot of opportunity for success here. You know, I talked about cynicism. You know, Tom had mentioned earlier, you know, that this is a very actionable thing because you can do things like, you know, buy carbon offsets. And while I know that that's a legitimate way to be more responsible, the cynic in me kind of rolls my eyes and says, well, you're just throwing money at the problem. You're not affecting any meaningful change in your own organization. So I do think that those who are coming into this either are more nimble or are brand new have a better shot at adhering to all of this.
Right.
And I think environmental solutions, like the products on this page, you know, it's like when you have like a straw that, you know, that is, you know, you can carry with you, you know, when you have, you know, even some of the things that we're dealing with, there's been a lot of weird backsliding. Like all of a sudden people are using more paper plates again because they're at home all the time and they don't want to use dishes as much. And, you know, I think a part of what, in a way, our industry can position itself as the offset to some of these things that are happening. You know, and I think that in its own way, I think that in general, consumers look at themselves as being able to make small changes, but industry as having the capacity to make great changes. And I think that sometimes that's with a great product, but also, that's why responsibility is important. But this is a time when people feel bad. We've spent, 2 decades making people feel bad about throwing out a paper plate, about, wearing, that cotton may be, sustainable, but there's a lot of costs to manufacture that are environmentally, disturbing. So people, they still know when something's bad. It's our opportunity to give them solutions that they can do as an alternate, or to offset some of these habits they don't feel quite so good.
Well, when you look at these trends of, the surge in products that are not disposable, or the opportunity to make products that last longer, it almost goes contrary to an industry, and not just the housewares industry, but just about every consumer industry that often makes its money by getting people to replace things at a faster rate. And we heard many years ago, as price became an issue, this is becoming a disposable business. If your coffee maker breaks, don't worry about it. You just go out and buy another one. It's almost like this movement has the potential to renew the call or the cry for product that does not have to go to waste as often, which represents another challenge for a business that wants to sell more of its product. But do we have other examples, Joe? Are there some examples in your research that kind of bear out the fact that these types of products that last longer, products that don't have to, whether it's a metal straw or whatever, is that starting to really show up in the numbers right now?
I'm not getting any real empirical data to support it completely, but I think you get a sense of what goes with it. I think we've hit some unique times, as Leana was talking about at the beginning, like right now, because of concerns about the virus, you might say, you know what, I got to put maybe this paper straw and stuff on the backside, or paper plates on the backside. Maybe I've got to use it right now to protect against this short term. So it's a little bit of a change, but there are industries that are seeing some interesting perspectives. I talked to a colleague of mine who talks on the sports industry, and how a lot of times Adidas has done a lot of great work with some of the tennis shoes that they're making that are making them disposable. A company called Parlay that are making shoes that are disposable and using it from ocean waste materials and stuff. So there's a lot of innovative, creative opportunities that were really starting to sprout up there in the last few years, of creative ways to apply this and extend it, as well as way different companies operated. Now it's just a continuing that we need to keep the energy with it, but we've got to realize there's a more real pressing issue right now in front of us as it relates to this virus.
Tom, try to look past the virus, but it's hard to do that right now. But longer term, what kind of products, and where is that innovation most likely to kind of happen? How do you see it?
Well, one of the things that what Joe just said brought to mind is materials are going to be extremely important. And one of the things that we've gotten used to in terms of a corporate culture is letting the manufacturers tell us what new materials they're using and what they've got available and so on and so forth, versus taking new materials and new technologies to them. But one of this is going to sound like a plug for an organization, but it's a library, so I'm going to let it go. Material Connection, it's spelled strangely, CONNEXION. But Material Connection is a materials library. They're an international materials library, but they've got a tremendous, it's a group of scientists that go around and find new materials that can answer anything from, whether it's a material that takes up, it's lighter, it takes up less space, and they are doing some amazing things with new materials and different approaches to sustainability, whether it's biodegradability, whether it's, lower impact on the front end, but it's staying in touch with new materials and what's available gives you a market advantage. And it's something that we really need to get used to doing on this side of things, and seeing what, what other technologies can help us do that. In terms of, what we're looking at on the page, I think that there are also people who are taking advantage and providing consumer solutions to their concerns vis-a-vis COVID. Like, we're seeing a lot more online promotions for carryable flatware. Because when you are going out, you want to stick, a fork, knife, spoon in your pocket in a little case, and then you can take it out, use it, and put it back. Because otherwise, you're like, who washed this, who handled it, whatever, but that in its own way is also an environmental savings, so I think that part of being responsible is also being responsible actions for people, and it's something I just wanted to hit on, which will take you into the next segment, I'm sure, with this retail responsibility or retail effects. But the implications at retail are we've got to be responsible for people's health, so and taking responsible actions for the people who walk into your store, that's brand building. I mean, that's brand building at its core.
Hey, Tom, for the benefit of someone in our audience, can you give us the name of that company, the materials company you just
it's called Material Connection, and you can find them at materialconnection.com, CONNEXION. They're led by a scientist named Andrew Dent, but they have international play as well. But you can go to their site and see what they do.
Thanks so much. Tom mentioned some of the, as we move into retail, but let's wrap up on product. Any other issues with regard to product development, Leana?
Yeah, I would just love to touch on the concept of extending the life of other products or making unusable usable. And you see some really interesting things happening now with people accepting less than perfect materials, products, et cetera, if in fact, they don't wind up going to waste. There's an entire trend, and I'm spacing on the name of it, around beauty and imperfection. And that's about things like, wood that is, wood that makes your coffee table.
Right.
That's exactly it. You even see that the ugly produce, the people get, it shows up here at work. We're getting the ugly produce there. And then on top of that, you have Housewares folks coming out with products with containers and with bags and with things that keep your food fresher for longer. So it doesn't, my vegetables don't all go bad in the vegetable drawer. And it extends beyond food too. You look at clothing care, and you look at how to make sure that instead of me having to go out and buy a new suit every couple years, that there's products out there that help me maintain and take care of my clothing without having to spend an excessive amount of time and money with a dry cleaner, right? Just that help me maintain my possessions so that I'm not cycling through them over and over again. And I think to your point, Peter, what you said about, that's unfortunate because then I'm not rebuying all the time. And I do think that's a place for innovation, right? Which is it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be I buy it once and I never buy it again. And it doesn't have to be every time I need it, I got to buy a new one. So what's the in-between on there that our industry can innovate around to find a happy medium?
It's funny, we often talk about innovation from a revolutionary standpoint. It's very rare that any innovation is so revolutionary, but it's very evolutionary, and that can happen day out. So I think it's an important part of the message that while this topic is so compelling and it almost demands instant responsibility, instant response, these are things that, while are urgent, still need to take some time to develop, and they can develop in stages. They don't have to develop overnight. And I think by taking that mindset, knowing that it's a fluid situation, it allows you not to get too far ahead at the same time. I'm going to actually lead into the retail implications with one of our audience's questions, because I think it sets up the discussion on retail quite nicely. The person asks, is interest, environmental, and social responsibility around a product affect purchase intent more in prestige or specialty level products than it does in the mass market? At what point in market segmentation does the spend in higher retail not decrease sales? So the question is this more of a higher end or a better part of the market opportunity, or is it actually a big opportunity across the board, including the mass market? Let's start with that first, and then move into some of the values that matter the most. Tom, what's your thought?
Well, I was just speaking to the head of product development in a different industry, West Point, which is a large textile company, and I think that there's a cognate. I mean, there's good, better, best in all of these offerings, and I think that every consumer is aware of it. The difference, the real question, I think, goes back to how much more are you willing to pay for it, and I think that it has to be embedded. I think responsibility is one of those things. There's been statistics that show that people talk a good game, they pay more, but at the end of the day, they really want responsibility built into the price of a comparable product. So I think that I think you have to have a good, better, best offering. You have to you have to engage every consumer that can make a difference and enable them to make a difference. So, but I think it's a very marketable, I think responsibility is not just expected, it's extremely marketable to every consumer.
Right, Joe, on the issue of, in channels where price may be the more compelling issue or whatever, as Tom alluded to, I feel like if you're a brand that sells across channels, that brand has to be consistent in its message no matter what. But do you see it playing out more as a premium opportunity more so than a mass market opportunity?
It all depends. It depends on what the product is, what you're trying to do. It's not a simple answer. The key is that it's tied exactly to who you're trying to target, though, and what their values and needs are. There are people that I know they will not buy coffee that has some sort of plastic with it because they're concerned about the heat and how it is with the metal, and their whole life is around sustainability and keeping things going with that reusability on items. So they're just going to be very much in it, and it's going to vary across different spectrums and different categories that they have. There are other folks that maybe play into different markets and it works out well. Like there's examples that come with that. I know in the shoe business that there are sometimes some marketing that happened, and it really was more for the younger men and how they played with things, and their incomes are very different. So there's a whole variety of ways it can happen. I think it's more driven by what is the nature of the product and who is that target market, what are they about, and then it goes from there.
Yeah, this idea of supporting retailers, can benefit from this by supporting responsible product lines and aligning themselves with credible brands. Leana, talk to that a little bit, but also how do retailers know they're aligning themselves with responsible product lines and responsible brands? Do they have to take it upon themselves to trust the vendor, or do they have to dig a little deeper than they might have as well?
Yeah, no, I think they have to dig a little bit deeper as well. Again, it goes back to that idea of authenticity. And if you're going to make a claim or if you're going to put something forward, you'd better have vetted that, because there's not a lot of room for forgiveness for putting out a claim and then it turns out to be false. Speaking just quickly to go back to what we were saying about the high end versus mass market, I would say too that as you talked about Gen Z and how they influence parents' purchases and everything else. And I think as that becomes more and more commonplace, Joe beat me to the punch on a story about his kids, but my daughter, who's 12 years old, she can sit and she can have an intellectual conversation about inequality and discrimination with any adult in the room. And she has very, very serious opinions about anybody who doesn't align with her point of view on that. She's 12. So, certainly how she feels influences how I purchase and how I shop. And then as she gets older, it'll perpetuate itself. So I think that even if the concept maybe, started or even a little bit feels higher end right now, I think the mass implementation of it, in the mass market is on its way very, very quickly.
By the way, I think we're going to do hold on. I think we're going to do the next series of these with, instead of us talking, we're going to get a bunch of 9, 10, 11, and 12-year-olds to talk. Okay. And unfortunately, they might, who knows, they might know more than we do.
You better.
Point. So, Tom, what's your thought on how on the retailer responsibility here and how they can make sure that they're completing the cycle from kind of product origin to the end user and making sure a product is vetted and a company is vetted and it serves its purpose from a responsibility angle?
Look, I think you have to ask the right questions, and you have to be smart. You have to keep asking and making sure you're getting the right answers. And I think retailers are getting better about that in terms of what they're assorting with, but I think the other thing that retailers have to do is you have to listen to consumers. As much as I think a lot of retailers count on manufacturers to listen to consumers, but consumers are so vocal now, and it really is a great opportunity to hear what they have to say. I mean, the whole, when you look at the speed to market, that poor freaking turtle, but the whole straw thing, it's a ubiquitous example, but it's like within that video went viral, and within 6 months, you had product on shelf that was, a replacement option. Within 12 months, you had major fast food chains taking it out of their, out of their bins and talking about it. So it's just listen to consumers. They have, not only will they tell you what they want, what's bothering them, what solutions they need. It's a really, and it's something that retailers can listen to consumers and react to it just as much as manufacturers can.
Manufacturers will have a certain cynicism in some of what you said because they feel that retailers often say, let's use, I want to buy a product, I want to focus on made in America, for instance. I'll take it away from core responsibility. And yet when it comes down to the negotiation, the vendor's going to say, well, I can make it in America, but it's going to cost 5 cents more. And the retailer says, well, it's not worth 5 cents more and they end up sourcing it from wherever they source it. Is this a time where there's less room for sort of gamesmanship in this negotiation? It has to be genuine, and everyone's got to recognize that to get on the same page, we've all got to be together. And will retailers, in your opinion, Tom, will they ultimately become more in partnership with these vendors on such issues?
I'm not. I'm not sure.
Everyone should know that Tom was a retailer at one point, so that's a good point.
Yeah. Well, half that question went under the sofa with my headset. So, but I think that I think one of the great there's two things that have to be acknowledged here. First is that brands are increasingly developing their relationships with consumers directly. Right. And so, there's going to be more input from them in the first place. And I think that retailers need to be both aware and wary of how that develops. But also I think that if you listen to what consumers are saying, it's also gotten quite local, and I think that retailers have to pay attention to what's going on locally. Like right now, Leana, you're talking about not being able to use canvas bags, okay? That's there, and it's in Atlanta, but it's not here. So really paying attention to regionally what's going on. Here, there's no more curbside, no more curbside
pickup.
Composting. Thank you. Composting. That's been completely eliminated. So it's like, well, how do you solve that? What does that mean to retailers here about composting in home? If we can't put it outside in the common bin. So it's all these things, and those are things that need solutions, but it means retailers listen to consumers on an almost local level.
And Joe, you've talked a lot about listen to the consumer. You speak to a lot of retailers and even more in the last several months. How do you respond to a vendor who may be somewhat cynical with regard to the retailer's role in this? Do you get a sense that retailers are really coming on board in execution, not just strategic or thinking, but they're actually doing it?
I think the retailers that I talk to, I think they all really are trying to understand their customers, and they're trying to help them as best they can. There is a passion to try to help the consumer. It's just not a place to sell goods, that they really are trying to fill a purpose and help them. So I think there is a path. And I think one of the things that they do very well is just the ability, as Tom said before, just asking a question. Just that is a powerful part of the equation right there. I think also people are realizing, including retailers, understanding that we live in a social world. So social media the news can travel fast, communication can travel fast. And so if you have a good story, if you have a good thing that you're helping with, it can really be beneficial. So I think they're completely well on board of trying to do the best that they can.
Leana, your thoughts before we move on to the next topic here?
No, I mean, I would certainly agree. I think, again, going back to your example, Peter, about the Made in America, it really depends on your customer, right? So if you're a retailer having that conversation with a supplier, and that supplier says, well, I can make it in America, but it's going to cost this much more. The retailer has to understand their customer well enough to know, is this important enough to my customer that I'm going to pay a little more to have it made that way, and they're going to pay a little more to purchase it that way. And I think certainly in the short term, I'm going to contradict a little bit of the stats I read off at the beginning about millennials spending more with brands that align with their social values, or being willing to pay 17.5% more on a $100 item. I think that that's in good times. I think that as we see how we come out of this crisis and we evaluate what, you know, people's disposable income and everything else looks like. And as they have to weigh that against their values, it could be a little different moving forward, even if it's just temporary.
One of the things I wanted to build on there is we got to remember there's no one consumer.
Right.
There's 330 million of them. So everything is different. And I remember many years ago working with the government, how do we help people get to eat more fruits and vegetables? Well, just tell them it's good and tell them it's healthy. That never worked. Like the consumer has a vote in taste and stuff like this. They have their own needs. It's the same thing. The retailers and the manufacturers also have other needs that they're trying to reach every consumer. And so you're trying to balance that as part of the equation. Now, the important part, though, it's an important thing that it needs to be on a daily basis, constantly pushing the envelope, constantly rolling the ball a little bit further and further, and just trying to be better every day.
Well, and Joe, what I love about what you just said there is that it goes back to the wellness session we did on Tuesday, where you said, yes, everyone knows they need to eat more fruits and vegetables, but what was the problem? What's been the hang up? Well, it hasn't been easy to execute at home. It hasn't been easy, you know, for a long time to make really good family-friendly, kid-friendly fruit and vegetable dishes. And you talked about how the home and housewares industry has solved a lot of that by coming out with different types of tools and gadgets and other things that we can use to find new and interesting ways to eat fruits and vegetables, to incorporate them into our home, about making it executable, right?
Right.
And I think there's some of that too. How can retailers help consumers? If they aspire to be responsible, how can retailers, you know, and manufacturers for that matter, give them a path towards that? Because
to that point, one of you mentioned disposability. I know we talked a little bit about retailers who have kind of increased the service of providing disposal options. You can talk about that, or are there some other services that you're aware of that have an opportunity to be more widely implemented? Tom, talk about the importance of at least offering something as basic as a disposal option for whether it's hard lines or otherwise difficult to dispose of goods.
It's so funny. I was going to ask you to ask me this, but I mean, my personal pet peeve, because it's part of my history, is flatware. I feel like the flatware industry and any industry that uses steel for implements, there is absolutely no. It's like you finish your flatware set, you're missing all but one fork, and you got to go buy something new. So so you either throw it out, maybe you put it in the metal recycling, maybe you go out and you buy a new set of flatware. I feel like, flatware companies are a prime opportunity to take responsibility, create retail partnerships where you bring in a flatware set, or you mail in a flatware set and you get some sort of a voucher for a discount on another flatware set, because this is all really highly processed steel. It doesn't need to be reprocessed again. It doesn't need to get lost in the morass of other metal recyclables out there and, detoxified all over again. It's ready to make new right then, and so it's, these are things that they're simple solutions that retailers don't, and manufacturers, but we have to partner. Well, it's about retail and manufacturer partnership.
And I think what retailers have to recognize, and hopefully many of them do, is that offering programs like that should not be viewed strictly as a cost center. Okay, because, and again, we talked about this at another session when I brought up the concept of the Amazon returns at Kohl's. If you give a consumer a reason to come in, then what you need to do, you've got them in the door. Now you have to find a way to convert that into a shopping experience as opposed to just a return or just a disposal opportunity. But certainly if you give me a way to recycle something that's going to make me feel better, and then you give me a reason to stay in the store, it's not purely a cost center for a retailer to do that.
Yeah, I'll say for me personally, I have one of those soda machines, and I use the carbonated water, and invariably whenever I return the canister, guess what? I'm spending money.
Yeah.
Well, Nespresso is a great example. They couldn't, Nespresso wanted to, it's like people were complaining that you couldn't recycle those Nespresso capsules, so they until they figured out a way to make them recyclable, they had you send them all back to them in prepaid envelopes that you would get with the coffee order, and it's just listening to the consumer, because now consumers don't want to know. It used to be consumers want to know you get me. Now consumers want to know you are me.
Exactly.
You're just like me,
But remember, retail is, especially brick and mortar, if not only, is all about traffic. And the more creative
Yeah.
you can be about driving traffic, more reasons you give the consumer an opportunity not just to go to the store, but to feel good about going to the store. They may not buy the product, another product then, but research continues to tell us that for every time they walk in the store, they buy something that, more often than not, the average registering is higher. And so this is one area where, if you make someone feel good about coming to the store because you're providing another service, I think it's a win-win for everyone. Any other thoughts on what retailers can do? I have an interesting question about retailers that I want to get to here, but before I get to that question, anything else on other retail services? No? Well, let's go to this question, because one of our people always asks about kind of retailers who, like grocery retailers, who have traditionally segregated a certain part of their business and the sustainable part of the business, whether it's natural foods and organic foods in one section and the ordinary stuff over here. When you get to the organic food area, you might be paying a little bit more, but you understand that because from a merchandising standpoint, it's been put together. Going forward, should retailers continue, of all types, kind of segregate the quote unquote responsible or sustainable product, whatever it might be, versus the other stuff? Should it be more of an integrated approach? Is there one way that works the best? Tom, you raise your hand there.
I don't think segregation is necessarily the answer, but I do think, one simple solution is you can go on a lot of different, I can go on Target, I can go on Walmart, I can go on Amazon, put a statement about responsibility, whatever that responsibility is. That should be some of the bullets in there, and you just don't see it.
Right.
You just don't see it. So tell me, is this a good product? When you can compare products on Amazon, but there's, is there a way to compare what their responsibility is? Is there a factor? Is there something you can say? People just, it may say it on the package, but when you're dealing so much with digital sales, it's another place where we should be doing what Joe was talking about. He's right. You have to be hearing it all the time. And this is some of the, we start thinking responsibly when we see other people thinking responsibly.
How does, Joe, how do you achieve that at the store level if you have to achieve it? Obviously, people doing research ahead of time, but at the store, is that comparison better off side by side, or is it better off in one department versus the other department?
Now, there's a lot of analytical money paid to answer that question. But what I will say is there's a lot of, there's ways that I can work both ways. I mean, you see some grocery stores, like I've got one next to me, where they will, in their produce area, they'll have it all kind of mixed together, but yet they will, from a canned goods or dry goods, they'll have them all separated. Right. So it's both areas can work. The question really is, if I'm the consumer, then how are you merchandising it? How are you making it aware and easily findable if I'm looking for it? And I think that's the key part. There's creativity. So there's obviously some retailers that focus 100% on it. You see the way restaurants operate, which is kind of a creative aspect on how they will market it, or whether they're a restaurant that has multiple options, or they're just focused on it as well. So there's no one right answer. But what I will say is that the ability to really make sure that if I'm that consumer who walks into whatever your retail outlet is, has the ability to find it, that's the key.
Leana, let's wrap up on this point. Why don't you give us some thoughts, kind of wrap up thoughts on this? And then also, if you can kind of explain, we're going to wrap up the session now, explain how folks can get their hands on the Market Watch report if they haven't already done that.
Of course. The only thing I would just add, I mean, I would love to actually give that question a lot more thought, because I think I could see it either way. I'll go back to what we talked about on Tuesday related to wellness and about cross-merchandising products, which is that if you look at responsibility and sustainability or whatever as a lifestyle, as opposed to, being kind of incidental, then I could see a bigger argument for bringing it all together in one place, so that a consumer who really is lifestyle oriented when it comes to responsibility can immerse themselves, right? But to Joe's point too, as long as you can find it within the masses, so that if I'm inclined that way, it's easily located, I think you're all good. In terms of the session and the report, so everyone who has attended this session will receive a follow-up email in about 24 hours. So look for it around this time tomorrow. that will have a link to download the full Market Watch report. It will also have a link to attend next week's final session, which is on Tuesday, again at 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. And it is not focused on a specific trend. It's really kind of an overall discussion and wrap up of the report and where we were when that report was released and where we are now and kind of what we think, might go on in the next few months as we proceed here. But a link to register for that webinar will also be in the email along with some information on IHA, NPD Group, and Springboard Futures.
Well, I want to thank our panelists, Leana, Joe, Tom. We went through some interesting trends the last couple of weeks. We started with time, we went to space, we went to experience, to wellness and responsibility. Obviously, these aren't the only trends sort of in the marketplace, but if you actually look at how they interact with one another, you'll see that it covers a lot of ground, and it's been a real informative and engaging couple of weeks. We look forward to wrapping things up and kind of looking ahead next week. So on behalf of Leana, Joe, Tom, I'm Peter Giannetti. We'll see you on Tuesday. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.